Hey, welcome back to Common Sense OT Security, where we solve the deepest mysteries of OT security using common sense. Today, we are going to take a look at Nozomi's H1 report for 2025 and see what we can learn from it. I'll just jump right into it. So let's have a quick look at the table of contents, which gives us an idea of the topics covered. I will mostly focus on the vulnerability landscape and the threat trends. There is some other stuff in there like botnets and excuse me, and wireless Wi-Fi risks, threats, etc., which I'm not going to focus on just because it doesn't affect our customers. And I try to learn something for our customer base, and let's see what this report yields for us. By the way, you can access the report on the Nozomi website. I urge you to do it and take a look for yourself. So let's start with the executive summary. Obviously, what you would expect here is a summary of the key findings that you will see in that report, which surprisingly it doesn't provide. I don't know why. So it does sum up here some key findings in respect to military conflicts. I doubt that this is the most important set of findings for all readers, but I'll get into that. The other thing that seems to be important here for Nozomi to point out, like the key finding, if you're a Nozomi Networks customer, you are covered for the vulnerabilities and threats in this report. This is something I honestly don't understand, because as far as I can tell, so this is the Nozomi product does not protect you against those threats. It does not remediate the vulnerabilities automatically. So I assume that when they say you are covered for the vulnerabilities and threats, they're actually meaning, okay, you will see all those vulnerabilities and alerts in your probably your Nozomi Vantage product. That's just my assumption. So apparently the key findings that they want to highlight is in respect to those military conflicts. We learn about something that happened a year ago. Guys, well, we're interested in the most recent trends, like from the first half of 2025. And there they say we observed a 133% increase in cyber attacks coming from well-known Iranian threat actor groups targeting US transportation and manufacturing organizations. Okay, so this is something that I'm really interested in. So I dive deeper. And that would take you to this, I think it's a blog post from Nozomi, where they provide some additional details on these threat activities. And this is what they base their number on, like the 133% increase between April and June. Now, certainly there are a couple of questions to raise here. First, if you look at the absolute numbers, in May, it was apparently 18 cyber attacks overall. And then in June, it dropped back to 10. So I think it's really not the most transparent statement to say, well, there was a 133% increase, because using the same data, I could claim that there was almost a 50% drop of cyber attacks from May to June. And unfortunately, this is obviously something that you will never find in any of these reports, because that could be interpreted like good news, right? And unfortunately, these reports and the blog posts, etc., have a tendency to always focus on bad news. Okay, let's go back to the report. Then they talk about Wi-Fi attacks. Again, I'm not particularly interested in that. In the introduction, they talk about the asset classes and the vulnerabilities. We'll get back to that. So I'm going to focus first on the threat data, and then I'll go back to the vulnerability information, which is somehow scattered across the report, but we'll get back to that with the CVSS course, etc. So let's jump into the really interesting stuff, in my opinion, and that is the threat trends in first half of 2025. And they, throughout the report, they use the MITRE attack framework in order to categorize those various threats or attack attempts or alerts, I think would be the most appropriate label for this. So the following table identifies the top 10 MITRE attack techniques used by hackers in the first half of 2025. And then you see here this table with the top 10. And I don't know how you approach this, but I honestly struggle to fully understand what the percentages refer to, because they don't tell us. So that is something that is surprisingly missing in this whole report. And I think that Nozomi could rather provide much more value if they would include something like a methodology section, which you would usually expect to see in this type of report that is seems to be based on empirical findings. And anytime when you see those percent values, the problem is they don't really reveal a lot of information if it's not clear what the percentages actually refer to. So let me give you a very simple example. This could be interpreted as relative percentages, like when you take all the attacks together, then 17.6% of all of those attacks were network denial of service. It could also mean something completely different, like 17.6% from the, I don't know, most likely many million alerts that they have picked up in their Nozomi Guardian products. And again, this is unfortunately something we don't know. So I think when you read further in the report, it seems to be implied that they are actually talking about percentages of alerts that they have seen, but it's not quite clear. And I think that would be an area of improvement. Let's go on. As we can see, various DOS attacks lead the chart in the first half of the the aim is to bring down important systems and cause damage to victim organizations. Various denial of service attacks. Okay, now I think now it gets really interesting, because this is how I understand the sentence. They seem to suggest these are actual attacks, actual cyber attacks. And I would find that hard to believe, because apparently the number must be very high. If you just look at the percentages, not necessarily in this table, but there are other tables where you see percentages like 0.0053 or something. And that would just suggest to the trained statistician that the sample size must be rather high. And also, I would imagine that if you look at all the alerts, you will be talking about many million. Now, what is the problem here? Obviously, there were not many million cyber attacks, cyber physical attacks. That does not compute. And if you go back to the other scale that I've mentioned to this blog post, where they have apparently identified 10 attacks related to the Ukraine situation or to the Iranian scenario, and how would that compare against probably hundreds of thousands of DOS attacks? And I would just imagine, well, we would have heard about those hundreds of thousands of attacks. They would not have been unnoticed. And therefore, as I interpret this, and again, so this is just my interpretation, and I'm just voicing my opinion here in order to probably incentivize Nozomi to clarify this in upcoming reports, because obviously this is data that the whole community is interested in, and so far we don't have a good grip on what that data actually is all about. So I would imagine that this is all about alerts that the Guardian sensors have picked up, and then obviously that number is not identical to actual cyber attacks. There are a couple of issues with that. So let's just assume you are counting the alerts. Well, guess what? You're getting multiple alerts for one and the same thing, for one and the same artifact. And are those then multiplied, or are they consolidated so that it's boiled to a count of just one for this instance, or what? We don't know. And therefore, I think it's very difficult to make sense out of the data. The other thing that I want to stress here is, what is the percentage? What is the relation of false positives? Because everybody knows that an alert must be validated, and most of the time it turns out, no, that was a false positive alert. And, I mean, I know that from our own experience, because some time ago a mutual customer contacted us. Well, you're getting this alert that the OT base would execute a man-in-the-middle attack, etc., which obviously was not true. And then I think Nozomi tweaked their heuristic algorithms, etc. But my point is here, we don't know what the numbers actually represent. I would argue, I would even bet $100 if you want, that these numbers are not about confirmed, validated cyber attacks, because it would be astronomically high, and we would have noticed otherwise. So therefore, again, I'm struggling to make sense out of the numbers, and that's bad, because I'm confident that there is something of value in here. It's just very difficult to get a grip on it. Okay, so then they break it down into various sectors, various industries, such as manufacturing, transportation, business services, and again, I have a hard time interpreting these results and how they would be actionable. So let's just assume at the end of the day, probably after some cleaning up, we would know network denial of service. That is the highest category, with the I would probably then call it attack attempts, or suspected attack attempts, whatever you want to call that. What does it give us? The idea that network denial of service and denial of service is pretty much on the same level, and man in the middle is a little bit lower. I don't know what action this would suggest the asset owner to take. And then it goes on and on and on. So they are breaking it down for countries, and the problem seems to be, well, just make it transparent what you are actually talking about, and how these results would prompt certain action. Here's the one example. They were talking about the following suspicious activity was detected the most in the customer's endpoints. And then you see something like malicious human interface devices was 0.0325%, and that is what was detected the fourth most. Sorry, but so the one thing that I get from this is that the sample size must be very high, because otherwise you would not see these numbers with 4 points after the decimal, right? So that's 4 digits after the decimal point. But we don't know. So, and that is, I think, very sad. And then we get to vulnerability. That's, in my opinion, like the second topic of interest in this report. And as I said earlier, it's somehow scattered across the report. So we'll jump back to the introduction, where we already see this chart, like a histogram, a distribution of CVSS. They call it risk scores. I don't know why, because the CVSS score is officially called the base score. And it's actually unrelated to risk, because, for risk, you have to also factor in cost of consequence and likelihood, right? So, but when it comes to CVEs, you're only talking about the vulnerability. You're not talking about cost of consequence, and you don't know about the likelihoods. So this is why those numbers are usually referred to as CVSS base scores rather than risk scores. They are not risk scores. I don't know why they're using this terminology here. So then we see that there is apparently an overrepresentation of base scores higher than 6. The one thing, and then they also break it down in various different ways, like for the sectors. And again, the one thing that I don't get here, maybe it's just me, what does this tell us? What are the numbers actually showing here? It seems to be that these are the numbers that their guardians, or the Vantage product, overall has collected when it comes to individual vulnerabilities. So not CVEs, but actual vulnerabilities. But I don't know. So we see the highest score here is, no, it must be the vulnerabilities, because that would be something like 130 million. And since there are only about 250,000 CVEs, then that leads me to believe that's the vulnerabilities that they have counted individually, and they seem to aggregate around the high base scores. Now, a question that I would have here is, how reliable is this information? And why do I ask that? For a very simple reason. If you know the product, but that's not a particular characteristic of Nozomi, you will find that in other threat detection products as well. When they expose vulnerabilities and CVEs, they always attach a likelihood and a probability, because the underlying asset inventory is not as accurate and precise that it would allow them to determine, well, we're absolutely confident this vulnerability affects this installation. And I mean, that is just an inherent problem with the technology. When you're doing passive scanning, this is what you end up with. But so the question that I would have is, when we look at these distributions here, which vulnerabilities are we talking about? So are we talking about only those that were established with absolute certainty, or also with a probability of, I don't know, 0.5 or something? I don't know. I think it would be interesting to have this information in order to interpret these results here and draw the right conclusions from those results. Okay, so I jump back to the second part where they talk about vulnerabilities. That was further down here. Vulnerability landscape and exploitability trends. So one other thing that baffled me a couple of times in this report, they are talking about trends, but a trend would imply some historical change, right? So you would see how things have changed from, let's just say, the past half year, right? So second half of 2024, and I didn't see that in that report, and so therefore I think it's a little bit difficult to really, or it's probably not appropriate to talk about trends here when you're only focusing on this data set from the first half of 2025. But anyhow, so now let's check out this vulnerability landscape, top CVEs affecting customer environments. And then they list 10 CVEs and also give us the base scores for those CVEs. And now, my friends, take a close look, please, I urge you, and tell me what do all these CVEs, the top 10 CVEs that affect their customer base, what do all of them have in common? Take a deep breath and think very hard. What do you think? It's a tough question. What do they have in common? Well, here's the answer. All of these 10 vulnerabilities are related with Google Chrome. As simple as that. Which shouldn't surprise you, because if you have followed our work, our webcasts, etc., you already know, well, web browsers are very, very high in the ranking. And the one thing that really surprises me is why they don't expose this. Because I think it's a very important insight. But this is something that they don't tell you. And why is this important? Because, I mean, why are we in this business? I think at the end of the day, it is because we want to reduce the attack surface. We want to actually make the environments more secure. And you don't accomplish that by thinking very hard about, well, that's an out-of-bounds read or a use after free. What does this give you, right? So if you know the CWE, use after free, use after free, use after. I mean, you can certainly go on and on and on if you specifically analyze all those IT vulnerabilities that you always find in the OT environment. Let me give you just a very quick reality check here. So the big picture, just briefly talk about the big picture. When you look at vulnerabilities, almost, or let's just say the biggest number of vulnerabilities that you're going to see is associated with IT products, period. First, it's the outdated operating system versions like Windows 7. Second, it's applications that come with that draw vulnerabilities along with them. And a particular area of concern is the web browsers. This is not limited to Google Chrome, so you would find similar issues with Firefox as an example. And I believe that's very important to understand. So because you want to reduce the attack surface. And it's when you then go to the details and the CWE, well, you also, this is use after free, okay, we got it. But what does it tell us? This is not actionable, my friends. This is my point here. This is the argument. That is not actionable intelligence. And therefore, I think it's even a little bit misleading here that they focus you on those CWEs, but don't tell you this is all associated with Google Chrome. And that is what you certainly would find when you check OT base. Let me see where I have this. My usual viewers, my friends that tend to watch the webcast every now and then will have seen this already. So this is a Pareto chart that OT-Base generates for you, where you see which software products account for the highest number of vulnerabilities, and also also these values include the CVSS base cores, because not every vulnerability is equal. And then you know this already, that Google Chrome, that's like the first application on that list, right? And so just in a nutshell, we also collect this type of data from customer installations. This is not what our customers are facing, but I would say it's similar. So this is a sample database which is pretty representative of what we see in the field. And the other thing that you would see here is and also all the stuff in gray that is related to operating systems, right? So the blue stuff is applications. Why the distinction? Because blue usually in OT-based means good. That means, that's worthwhile exploring, because you actually can update your applications, Google Chrome being a case in point, without waiting for planned downtime. So that is like a low-hanging fruit when you think about remediation, right? Whereas an operating system update, that is a nightmare. And therefore, we color code those in gray. Okay, so, and this allows me to point at a really fundamental aspect of what we are doing with OT base in the context of OT security, which we call performance-based OT security. We think it doesn't give you much if you understand which CWEs have been used. What really matters at the end of the day is how many vulnerabilities you have been able to remediate, and especially those with potentially high impacts. This is where all the risk then comes in, like the cost of consequence, the criticality of the devices. Okay, then when you start to talk about the system dependencies, etc. So that is performance-based vulnerability management that has a clear objective to make you more secure. And I don't see how the CWEs would help you with that, and just not telling the world, well, actually, guys, we have a very important finding here. Actually, the top 10 CVEs that we have found, they all refer to Google Chrome. Isn't that interesting? I think it's very interesting. So that is my most important practical takeaway from the report. And the other thing that I've mentioned now a couple of times, I think they could do a much, much better job for their upcoming reports if they would include a methodology section that clearly expresses how the numbers, or what the numbers represent. What is the total sample size, as an example? Right? And certainly, so don't think I'm trying to bash Nozomi here. No, that's not the intention. You will find that with reports from other companies as well. And just as a piece of advice from a statistician, don't just take percent values at face value and, oh, this is an interesting finding or important finding. No, it's not. Until you know what it actually represents. And a very important piece of information in that regard is the total sample size, which I don't know what it is. And so again, I think easy low-hanging fruits, how to spice up upcoming reports so that all of us can get much more value out of those reports. So with that, let's look. I think we have one comment or one question. Gary D at Forensic Drone. Why ask all these questions, Ralph, when we already know it is written to make us worry? To do this, it has to sound big. Well, probably Gary, you may have a point here. But then on the other hand, I would allege, I have reason to assume that Nozomi is not 100% driven by marketing that has the objective to instill fear. So I think there will be many, many good people, many fine people at Nozomi. I just take that for granted. And why don't use the numbers that they have, that they must have, and allow us to allow like the OT security community to identify, let's just say, interesting developments, interesting ways how to remediate vulnerabilities better, and just move forward to a more secure OT infrastructure. So that is why I'm discussing this. So this is not about just bashing Nozomi. There are fear mongers, etc. I think, well, I would just allege that there is some disconnect sometimes between the marketing department and the rest of the engineers, and this may be one example. So with that, those are my thoughts on the Nozomi report. There is room for improvement. Let's just see what the next report is going to give us. See you next week.